When a young Navy SEAL mocked an elderly man's simple ring at a military ceremony, he had no idea he was humiliating someone whose mathematical genius once prevented nuclear war. The shocking revelation that followed would silence an entire naval base. Hit like if you love stories of hidden heroes, subscribe for more incredible military tales, and comment where you're watching from. The ceremonial hall of Naval Base Hartsfield emanated calculated solemnity. Flags hung in perfect rows, their fabrics catching the cold light of fluorescent lamps. Golden standards flanked the honors table, where microphones awaited speeches yet to come. Civilian guests adjusted ties, while military personnel checked their posture in discrete formation. Harold Whitmore walked slowly between the empty chairs, his steps echoing on polished marble. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he held the lukewarm coffee cup, steam rising in spirals that dissolved in the conditioned air. The ring on his right ring finger caught fragments of light, dull silver, worn by time, apparently worthless. 68 years weighed on his curved shoulders. The gray suit, bought on clearance 3 years ago, hung loose on his thin frame. No one had greeted him at the entrance. No one had asked his name. He was just another protocol guest, present because someone, somewhere, had decided that former Navy administrative personnel should be represented. The presenter tested the microphone, producing sharp feedback that made Harold blink. Ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly begin the presentation of the new Inter-Unit Naval Operability Program. A group of young officers conversed near the side wall. Their uniforms were impeccable, their postures erect as blades. Among them stood out Logan Reese, a 26-year-old petty officer, chest adorned with service ribbons that told stories of missions Harold would never know. Logan's smile was wide, confident, the smile of someone who knew his place in the world. Harold observed them for a moment, then looked away to his ring. He turned it unconsciously, a habit maintained for decades. On the inner part, almost imperceptible engraving flickered under the light. EOS 117 Delta. The letters were so worn they looked like scars in the metal. "Hey, sir," Logan's voice cut through the polite murmur of the environment. Harold raised his head, meeting blue eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "Why are you wearing that ugly ring?" Logan laughed, looking at the colleagues flanking him. "Bingo souvenir." Silence spread in concentric waves. Conversation ceased. Heads turned. Harold felt the weight of dozens of gazes, some amused, others embarrassed. His right hand trembled more visibly. "It has history, kid," Harold murmured, voice low like the buzz of a distant bee. Logan laughed louder, a sound that ricocheted off the walls. Two nearby lieutenants exchanged glances. One smiled discreetly, another frowned with polite disapproval. The security camera in the upper corner caught everything. The close-up on Logan's laughing face, the cut to Harold's trembling hands gripping the coffee cup, the wide shot of the hall where contained laughter mixed with uncomfortable whispers. Harold took a step back, seeking the shadows near the wall. The ring continued to turn on his finger. Automatic movement, almost desperate for an instant. Under direct light, the inner engraving flickered like silent Morse code. In his jacket's inner pocket, a military dog tag rubbed against the fabric. He hadn't worn it around his neck for decades but had never been able to throw it away. Like the ring, it was a fragment of something that once defined who he was. History. Logan took another step forward, savoring the audience that had formed. "What kind of history, sir? Desk military service." A nearby commander cleared his throat discreetly, suggesting perhaps it was time for Logan to stop. But the young SEAL was intoxicated by the attention, the complicit smiles, the sense of power that came from publicly humiliating someone. Harold didn't respond. He just kept turning the ring, looking at an indefinite point on the marble floor. His breathing had become more controlled, not from nervousness but from something different, something Logan didn't recognize because he had never learned to identify it. Discipline. The murmur of conversations resumed, but now carried a different quality. Some guests observed Harold with renewed curiosity. Others looked away, embarrassed by the unnecessary cruelty. At the honors table, an officer checked documents. Behind him, standards fluttered gently in the air conditioning, as if whispering secrets that only a chosen few were destined to hear. Harold moved away toward the side corridor, steps still slow, but now carrying something different. Something that Logan, in all his youth and arrogance, couldn't understand. The ring continued to turn, inner engraving flickering like a beacon amid the storm of humiliation. The ceremony was about to begin. But another story, a much older one, had just been awakened. The side corridor offered temporary refuge from the public spectacle. Cracked leather benches lined walls adorned with historical photographs, ships, commanders, moments of military glory captured in faded black and white. The pause system voice echoed distantly. "Guests, please take your seats." Harold sat on the bench closest to the window, where natural light filtered through Venetian blinds. His hands automatically found the worn cap he carried in his lap. He hadn't worn it during the ceremony, but couldn't leave it in the car. It was faded navy blue, with an emblem few would recognize. His fingers explored the familiar texture of the fabric while his breathing stabilized. Inhale, exhale, control. Some things were never unlearned, no matter how much time passed. From his inner pocket, he withdrew a dog tag that hadn't seen daylight for months. The metal was darkened, but the engraved numbers remained legible under his thumbs. He turned it between his fingers like a secular rosary, each movement bringing echoes of a life that existed long before Logan Reese was born. A small notebook emerged from his side pocket, oxidized metal spiral, pages yellowed by years of handling. Harold opened it to a specific page where notes in faded blue ink formed patterns that looked like maps or codes. Numbers, coordinates, abbreviations. He himself had created decades ago. His hands, even trembling, moved with unconscious precision over the pages. Muscle memory. His fingers traced invisible routes, calculated distances that no longer existed, verified data from missions that officially never happened. An almost imperceptible flash crossed his mind. Young hands steady, working over maps illuminated by desk lamps, coordinates being plotted, tense voices on the phone, the weight of decisions that would save or condemn men whose names he would never know. Always arrived early, he thought, closing the notebook. Always saw before the chaos. In the distance, a military command echoed. "Attention on deck." Harold automatically straightened his posture, muscles reacting to a conditioned reflex that 4 decades of civilian life had never managed to erase. His shoulders aligned, chin rose 2 degrees, feet positioned at precise angles. The movement lasted only 3 seconds, but was executed with a perfection that would have impressed any military instructor. Then, as if awakening from a dream, Harold relaxed again, returning to the curved posture of an ordinary elderly man. From his worn leather wallet, a faded challenge coin peeked between credit cards and yellowed receipts. It was once golden, but now showed only metallic traces where the gold had peeled away, on the main face. An almost illegible emblem on the opposite face, numbers that matched those in the notebook. Harold slid it between his fingers, feeling the familiar weight. Challenge coins were military tradition, given for achievements, carried as symbols of belonging. This one was different. This had been delivered not for visible service, but for service that could never be publicly recognized. Until now, inside his coat, folded with military care. A patch showed faded colors that were once green and gold. The emblem was complex. An eagle, geographical coordinates, numbers that would reference units that existed only in classified files. Harold touched it through the fabric, checking its presence like a talisman. Voices approached through the corridor, officers talking about protocols, schedules, last-minute adjustments for the ceremony. Harold quickly put away his objects, but not before one last look at the dog tag. The numbers engraved in the metal seemed to pulse under the filtered light, as if carrying their own energy. A sergeant hurried past, speaking into his radio. "Yes, sir, I suggest involving administration. We have a protocol situation requiring clarification." Harold knew it was about him. He knew that Logan had planted a seed of doubt that was now growing in the base's corridors of power. In a few hours, questions would be asked, files would be consulted, and people like Chief Owen Mallory, whom Harold had just noticed watching him through the glass door, would begin asking uncomfortable questions. The ring continued turning on his finger. EOS 117 Delta flickered under the light, waiting for someone to finally ask what it meant. Harold stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked back to the hall. The discipline in his steps was almost imperceptible, but it was there, ghost of a soldier who had never really stopped serving. The protocol room adjacent to the main hall breathed contained authority. Polished oak table dominated the center, flanked by leather chairs where official documents awaited signatures. Internal security cameras blinked discreetly in the corners, recording every word, every gesture, every micro-expression. Logan Reese stood beside the table, militarily correct posture but with a smile that couldn't disguise his satisfaction. 3 superior officers flanked Commander Robert Hayes, who leafed through papers with growing irritation. Harold Whitmore entered escorted by a lieutenant, not arrested, just invited for clarification. His hands trembled more visibly now, but his steps maintained a rhythm few noticed. Automatic discipline, Mr. Whitmore. Commander Hayes raised his eyes from the documents. Why don't you cooperate to end this? Petty Officer Reese simply questioned the authenticity of your identification. Logan leaned over the table, indicating a temporary badge Harold had received at the entrance. The number doesn't correspond to our current records, sir. And that ring, he laughed quietly, looks more like fair jewelry. I won't lie for anyone's comfort, Harold replied, voice calm as a lake surface before the storm. Hayes slammed the documents against the table, producing a dry sound that cut through the air conditioning. Sir, we offer an easy path. Admit there was a misunderstanding about your credentials, withdraw discreetly, and we'll end this situation without embarrassment for anyone. On the table, Harold's badge lay among official forms. The identification number showed a clear discrepancy, too recent for someone claiming to have served decades ago. Beside it, a magnifying glass revealed details of the ring Logan had ridiculed, almost imperceptible inner engravings, where consistent with decades of use. Murmurs grew in the corridor. Through the glass door, ceremony guests whispered, some pointing discreetly at the room where the incident was unfolding. The humiliation was public now, not just personal. A younger commander, Major Peterson, diplomatically cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, we understand that military memories can evolve over time. Perhaps it's simply a matter of recollections that became larger than the facts. Harold looked directly at Peterson, and for a moment his posture changed imperceptibly. Straighter shoulders, raised chin, direct and firm gaze. Major, how many years of active service do you have? 12 years, sir. And how many classified operations have you commanded? Peterson hesitated. That's not relevant. It is. Harold slowly turned the ring. Because some of us learned there's a difference between serving in peacetime and serving when nobody can know you exist. The silence in the room became dense. Logan, who expected an embarrassed confession, frowned. There was something in Harold's voice, something in the way his eyes focused that didn't match the image of a confused elderly man carrying costume jewelry. Hayes leaned forward. Sir, are you suggesting you served in operations not in the records? I'm saying some records were archived for reasons you don't have authority to question. The answer hung in the air like smoke. Logan laughed nervously. Oh, come on, secret operations, archived records. This is movie stuff, not reality. But through the glass door, Chief Owen Mallory watched with growing interest. 28 years of service had taught him to recognize when someone spoke with genuine authority, and when someone invented stories to impress. Harold wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply telling the truth. Mallory stepped away from the door, quickly heading for the base's historical archives. If Harold was lying, it would be easy to prove. But if he was telling the truth, Hayes closed the folder in front of him. Mr. Whitmore, without official documentation, we cannot accept claims about classified service. We suggest that you can verify the code AOS 117 Delta, Harold interrupted calmly, if you still have authorization to access files prior to 1982. The silence was now absolute. Logan stopped smiling. Peterson exchanged glances with Hayes. None of them recognized the code, but the specificity of the date, the precision of the reference, the complete absence of hesitation in Harold's voice. Hayes picked up an internal phone. Connect me with historical archives now. Harold remained seated, turning the ring, waiting. 43 years of secrecy were about to end. He wondered if he was ready for the consequences. Outside, Mallory was already running. The base's historical library occupied a basement where time seemed to have stagnated. Cold fluorescent light bathed rows of physical archives that computers had never touched. Documents from an era when secrets were kept in paper and ink. Not bytes and pixels, the air smelled of dust and chemical preservative. Chief Owen Mallory opened the drawer catalogued as Special Operations, 1975-1985, with slightly trembling hands. 28 years of naval career had taught him that some mysteries were better left buried. But Harold Whitmore's voice, the precision of his words, the complete absence of bravado. "Can I see the ring?" he had asked discreetly when Harold was leaving the protocol room. Harold extended his hand without hesitation. Mallory used a small magnifying glass, standard equipment for document verification. Focusing on the ring's inner part, the engravings were almost imperceptible, but they were there. EOS 117 Delta, followed by numbers that looked like a date in military code. "Haven't heard that call sign since 1992, he murmured to himself, feeling a chill run up his spine. His fingers flew through manila folders, each marked with classification levels that made him pause. Most were still sealed, red stamps warning about unauthorized access penalties, but one folder, thicker than the others, bore a notation that made him freeze. Operation Nightbridge, lead analyst, H.E. Whitmore. The folder was heavy, filled with documents that spoke of crisis management, strategic analysis, algorithmic solutions to problems that officially never existed. Mathematical formulas covered pages in handwriting that matched the precision of Harold's voice. Signatures at the bottom of reports. Always the same. H.E. Whitmore, Chief Analyst, EOS 117 Delta. Mallory's hands shook as he photographed pages with his secure phone. Each document painted a picture of a man who had lived in the shadows, making decisions that saved lives without anyone knowing his name. The dates spanned years, 1975 to 1981, when Harold would have been in his 30s. At the peak of intellectual powers now hidden behind trembling hands and aged appearance, a black and white photograph fell from between the pages. A group of 12 people in military dress, standing before a complex array of early computers. In the back row, partially obscured by shadows, stood a young man whose eyes held the same quiet intensity Mallory had seen in Harold's face, the same Harold who was being humiliated 3 floors above. "Jesus Christ," Mallory whispered, photographing the image. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Pentagon. Someone very high up the chain had been notified of the inquiry. The message was brief. "Any files regarding EOS 117 operations require Admiral clearance. Do not proceed without authorization." Mallory stared at his phone, then at the documents spread before him. In 30 minutes, Harold Whitmore had gone from being a confused old man with costume jewelry to being someone whose mere mention triggered Pentagon protocols. He gathered the documents, sealed them in a classified evidence bag, and headed for the surface. Commander Hayes needed to see this. More importantly, someone needed to find Admiral Marcus Halden, the only person on the East Coast with authorization to unseal what Harold Whitmore had spent 40 years keeping secret. As he climbed the stairs, Mallory's mind raced. If Harold was who these documents suggested, then Logan Reese hadn't just humiliated an old man. He had humiliated someone whose algorithms had probably saved Logan's life a dozen times over during deployments he would never know about. The ring wasn't costume jewelry. It was proof of service that had been deliberately hidden from history, and Harold had been waiting 40 years for someone to finally ask the right questions. The base command center hummed with controlled urgency. Wall-mounted screens displayed global naval positions while encrypted communications crackled through secure channels. Chief Mallory stood before the main communication console, his classified evidence bag clutched in hands that hadn't stopped shaking since he'd left the archives. "Sir, I need verification on sequence EOS 117 Delta." Mallory spoke into the secure phone, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was requesting. "If I'm right, there's a file that should never have been buried." The young archive officer on the other end sighed audibly. "Chief, I'm showing nothing here. EOS designation was discontinued in 1982. Whatever you think you found, check the Pentagon backup servers." Mallory interrupted. "Cross-reference with Operation Nightbridge." A pause, keyboard typing. Then, "Chief, I'm going to transfer you to someone with higher clearance. This is above my authorization level." Mallory waited, watching through the command center's windows as base personnel went about their normal duties, unaware that history was being rewritten 3 floors below their feet. The bag beside him contained documents that could change how the Navy understood its own past, if anyone was willing to listen. Chief Mallory, a new voice, older, carrying the weight of authority. "This is Captain Morrison, Pentagon Archives. What exactly are you claiming to have found?" "Sir, documents proving that Harold E. Whitmore was chief analyst for a classified strategic unit. Mathematical algorithms, crisis management protocols, operational reports spanning 6 years of service that officially never existed." Another pause. Longer this time. "Chief, those files are sealed at Admiral level. How did you access?" "Sir, the man himself is here being questioned about the authenticity of military credentials he has every right to carry." The line went quiet for nearly 30 seconds, when Captain Morrison spoke again. His voice carried a different quality, urgency mixed with something approaching alarm. "Chief, do not discuss this over unsecured channels. I'm contacting Admiral Halden directly. Keep Mr. Whitmore secure and comfortable until further notice. This matter now has Pentagon priority." The line went dead. Mallory stared at his phone, understanding that he had just triggered something far larger than a simple identity verification. Somewhere in Washington, people were being awakened from sleep, pulled from meetings, asked to remember secrets they had hoped never to revisit. 3 floors above, Harold Whitmore continued to turn his ring, waiting patiently as he had waited for 40 years. The difference was that now, someone had finally asked the right questions, and Admiral Marcus Halden was about to remember a young analyst who had once saved more lives than the Navy could ever publicly acknowledge. The ceremonial hall had been reconfigured in the space of an hour. What had been a simple presentation venue was now something approaching a military tribunal, with microphones repositioned and a solitary chair placed center stage. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Conversations had ceased, replaced by the tension that preceded revelations. Admiral Marcus Halden entered through the main doors with the measured pace of someone carrying the weight of history. 63 years old, silver-haired, with ribbons on his chest that told stories of 3 decades in naval intelligence, his eyes swept the assembled crowd before settling on the elderly man seated quietly in the front row. Harold Whitmore looked smaller than Halden remembered, but the posture was unmistakable. Straight-backed despite age, hands folded precisely, eyes alert beneath weathered features. 40 years had passed since their last conversation, but Halden would have recognized that quiet intensity anywhere. The Admiral approached slowly, stopping directly in front of Harold. The entire hall held its breath. "Mr. Whitmore," Halden said quietly, just loud enough for the front rows to hear, "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Harold looked up, meeting Halden's gaze without surprise, without relief, without anything except the patient acknowledgement of someone who had waited decades for this moment. "Admiral," Harold nodded slightly. "I wondered if anyone would remember." Halden opened the classified folder he carried, revealing documents that had been sealed in Pentagon vaults since the Reagan administration. The mathematically precise handwriting was visible even from several rows back. Complex algorithms and strategic assessments that most in the room wouldn't understand if they studied them for years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Halden's voice carried easily through the hall, "I need to correct a grave injustice that has persisted for far too long." He turned to face Logan Reese, who had gone pale, understanding instinctively that whatever was about to happen would change everything. "This man," Halden gestured to Harold, "wrote the strategic algorithms that kept our Pacific Fleet operational during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. His analysis prevented conflicts that could have escalated to nuclear exchange. His work saved lives you will never know about, prevented tragedies that never made headlines because they never happened." The silence was absolute now. Harold's hands remained folded, but his breathing had changed. Deeper, steadier. The breathing of someone finally allowed to stand straight after decades of carrying weight alone, Halden continued, his voice gaining strength. Harold Edward Whitmore served as Chief Strategic Analyst for Advanced Operations Squadron 117, a unit whose existence was classified at the highest levels, for 6 years. From 1975 to 1981, he worked 18-hour days in basement offices, analyzing threat patterns and developing response protocols that became the foundation for modern naval strategy. The Admiral reached into his folder and withdrew a photograph, the same black and white image Mallory had found in the archives. He held it up for the assembly to see. Operation Nightbridge, 1979. A Soviet submarine flotilla was positioned to cut our supply lines to Southeast Asia. Traditional analysis suggested 6 months to decode their movement patterns. Mr. Whitmore's algorithms did it in 6 days. Harold closed his eyes briefly, remembering sleepless nights, coffee cups growing cold while he worked through variables that measured the space between peace and war. The menu humiliated. Halden's gaze found Logan Reese again. Likely exists today because Harold Whitmore never stopped thinking 5 moves ahead of our enemies. The ring on Harold's finger caught the light as he unconsciously turned it. No longer costume jewelry, it was proof of service that had been deliberately hidden from history to protect operations that officially never happened. Admiral Halden had come to set the record straight. Commander Hayes cleared his throat nervously, the sound echoing in a hall that had become a court of reckoning. Admiral Halden, we had no way of knowing. The records we accessed showed no mention of Mr. Whitmore's service level. Halden's expression hardened. That, Commander, is exactly the problem we're here to address. The Admiral gestured for Logan Reese to step forward. The young SEAL complied, his earlier confidence replaced by growing dread as he understood the magnitude of his error. Petty Officer Reese, Halden's voice carried the weight of military justice. You questioned this man's credentials, ridiculed his service, and humiliated him in front of his peers. What do you have to say for yourself? Logan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for discovering that the old man he'd mocked was responsible for strategic innovations that had probably saved his life during deployments he'd never known were at risk. I thought it was a joke, Logan stammered. The ring looked like... I didn't know. You didn't know, Halden repeated coldly, because you assumed that age meant irrelevance, that humble appearance meant insignificance, that a man's worth could be measured by the shine of his accessories. The Admiral turned to address the entire assembly. This institution has failed Harold Whitmore twice. First, by classifying his service so deeply that even his existence was erased from official records. Second, by creating an environment where such disrespect could flourish unchecked. A senior captain in the third row cleared his throat. Admiral, what are your orders regarding this matter? Halden opened another folder, revealing documents with Pentagon letterheads and signatures that carried the highest military authority. Effective immediately, we are conducting a full audit of classified personnel records from 1975 to 1985. We will identify others whose service has been similarly erased and begin appropriate recognition procedures. He paused, allowing the implication to settle over the room. Furthermore, Mr. Whitmore will receive the recognition that was denied him for 4 decades. Today, I am authorizing the first step in that process. Halden reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside lay a replica of the AOS 117 unit insignia, the same emblem that Harold had carried folded in his coat pocket for 40 years. Mr. Whitmore? Halden's voice softened. Would you please stand? Harold rose slowly, dignity returning to his posture with each inch he gained. The tremor in his hands lessened as muscle memory took over. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward. For the first time in decades, he stood as the officer he had always been. Halden approached and pinned the insignia to Harold's jacket. The United States Navy acknowledges your service and apologizes for the delay in this recognition. The applause began slowly, uncertainly, then built until it filled the hall. Harold stood quietly, absorbing the sound he had never expected to hear, feeling the weight of official acknowledgement after decades of silence. Logan Reese stood apart from the applause, understanding that his career had changed permanently, not ended. Halden wasn't vindictive, but forever marked by this lesson in humility and respect. The Admiral had delivered justice. Now came the harder work of rebuilding what had been broken. The base mess hall at sunset carried a different atmosphere than the formal ceremony. Long shadows stretched across empty tables, while the last light of day filtered through windows overlooking the airfield. Only 3 men remained, Harold Whitmore, Chief Mallory, and Admiral Halden, sharing coffee and the kind of conversation that could only happen after secrets had finally been spoken aloud. I should have looked for you sooner, Halden said quietly, stirring his coffee with the slow deliberation of someone weighing decades of regret. When the unit disbanded, when the files were sealed, I told myself it was about national security. Truth was, it was easier to let sleeping dogs lie. Harold's hands were steadier now, the tremor fading as tension released from muscles that had carried weight for too long. "You had your orders, Admiral. We all did." Mallory leaned forward, curiosity overcoming protocol. "Mr. Whitmore, what was it like, knowing your work saved lives but never being able to talk about it?" Harold turned his ring slowly, a habit that now carried different meaning for everyone who observed it. "Chief, you ever hear a sound that wasn't there? Know something was wrong before anyone else figured it out?" "Sometimes, sir. Pattern recognition from experience. That's what we did. We listened to the silence between radio transmissions, measured the spaces where enemy submarines should be but weren't, calculated the mathematical probability of peace versus the certainty of war." Harold's voice carried the weight of memories that had never been shared. "Every equation we solved meant someone's son came home who might not have otherwise." Halden nodded slowly. Operation Nightbridge wasn't just about Soviet submarines. It was about preventing a cascade failure that could have triggered automatic response protocols on both sides. The Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, Mallory understood. But this time in the Pacific, where response times were measured in minutes instead of hours. Harold reached into his jacket and withdrew the small notebook he'd been carrying all day. Its pages were filled with notations that looked like mathematical poetry, elegant solutions to impossible problems. "Dmitry Volkov," Harold said, opening to a specific page. "Soviet naval analyst, just like me. We never met, never spoke, but we played chess through submarine movements for 3 years. I learned to think like him, predict his patterns." He traced a finger across equations that had prevented conflicts the world never knew about. In '79, his patterns changed, became more aggressive, more desperate. Either he was planning something catastrophic, or, Harold paused, a slight smile crossing his features, or he was trying to get someone's attention, trying to warn us. Halden's eyes widened. "You're saying he was feeding you intelligence?" "I'm saying mathematics has no nationality, Admiral, and some people, on both sides, understood that mutual destruction isn't a strategy. It's a failure of imagination." The three men sat in silence, contemplating the implications of what Harold had just revealed. Somewhere in Russia, an elderly man might be sitting alone, carrying his own secrets about prevented catastrophes, wearing his own version of a simple ring that nobody understood. "Mr. Whitmore," Halden said finally, "there's something I need to tell you about why your records were sealed so deeply." Harold's expression didn't change, but his attention focused with the same intensity Mallory had noticed during the confrontation with Logan. "You saved more than naval operations. You prevented a war. But the methods you used, the mathematical models you developed, they were too effective, too accurate. Command decided that if enemies discovered how precisely we could predict their movements, they might develop countermeasures that could leave us blind." Halden leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "So they buried you, buried your methods, your innovations, your very existence. Kept the algorithms but erased the man who created them." Harold absorbed this information without apparent emotion, but his hand moved unconsciously to touch the spot where Halden had pinned the unit insignia. "And now the Cold War is over, and the world deserves to know what you accomplished. More importantly, you deserve the recognition that was stolen from you." Harold closed his notebook and slipped it back into his jacket. When he looked up, his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there during the morning's humiliation. "Admiral, I spent 40 years wondering if it had all been worth it, wondering if the silence, the isolation, the weight of carrying secrets, if any of it mattered." He gestured toward the window, where the last light of sunset painted the base in gold. "Today, for the first time since 1981, I know it was." The three men finished their coffee in comfortable silence, each processing the day's revelations in his own way. Outside, the evening watch began their duties, protecting a peace they might never know had been preserved by equations written in a basement office 40 years ago. 23 weeks later, the same airfield that had witnessed Harold's humiliation now hosted a different kind of ceremony. Morning sunlight reflected off polished memorial plaques, newly installed along the main walkway. The largest bore an inscription that most base personnel would walk past without understanding, but a few would pause to read. "Advanced Operations Squadron 117, 1975-1981. Their service remains classified. Their sacrifice remembered. Harold Whitmore walked slowly toward the memorial, no longer alone. Chief Mallory accompanied him on the left, Admiral Halden on the right. The tremor in Harold's hands had lessened significantly, though it would never entirely disappear. Some effects of carrying weight for decades couldn't be completely erased. The ring on his finger caught the light differently now, still worn, still simple silver, but no longer hidden. The challenge coin in his pocket had been joined by official documentation from the Pentagon, a letter on formal letterhead acknowledging his service and inviting his participation in a classified historical review panel. Logan Reese stood at attention near the memorial's dedication area. The young SEAL had requested permission to attend, to witness the completion of what he had unknowingly begun. His career would continue. Halden believed in education over destruction, but his perspective had changed permanently. "Mr. Whitmore," Halden said as they reached the memorial, "would you do the honors?" Harold stepped forward and placed his challenge coin in a small ceremonial receptacle built into the memorial's base. The coin settled with a soft metallic sound that seemed to echo across decades of silence. The ceremony was brief, attended by only a handful of people with sufficient clearance to understand what was being commemorated. No press, no public recognition. The nature of the service being honored required continued discretion. But as Harold stepped back from the memorial, something had changed in his posture. The weight he had carried alone for 40 years had been acknowledged, shared, and finally given proper place in history. "Sir," a young voice interrupted the moment. A petty officer, barely 20, approached with careful respect. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask." "The mathematics mentioned in the historical brief about pattern recognition and strategic prediction, is that something that could be adapted for current threat assessment?" Harold looked at the young officer with interest. For the first time in decades, someone was asking about his work not as historical curiosity, but as living, applicable knowledge. "Son," Harold said, and his voice carried the authority that Logan Reese should have recognized months earlier. "Mathematics doesn't retire, neither do the people who understand how to use it properly." Halden smiled, understanding that Harold's story wasn't ending with this ceremony. It was beginning a new chapter. 6 months later, Harold would be invited to brief current naval intelligence personnel on pattern recognition methodologies. His algorithms, updated for modern computational power, would once again serve to keep peace through preparation. But today, standing before a memorial that finally acknowledged his existence, Harold Whitmore allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The ring on his finger no longer carried the weight of secrets. It carried the honor of service remembered. The old man who had been humiliated for wearing costume jewelry walked away from the ceremony with dignity fully restored, ready to serve again in whatever capacity his experience might benefit the next generation. Behind him, the memorial caught the afternoon light, and the inscription seemed to glow with the quiet pride of service that had waited 40 years to be recognized. The circle was complete, but the story continued. The base mess hall at sunset carried a different atmosphere than the formal ceremony. Long shadows stretched across empty tables while the last light of day filtered through windows overlooking the airfield. Only 3 men remained: Harold Whitmore, Chief Mallory, and Admiral Halden, sharing coffee and the kind of conversation that could only happen after secrets had finally been spoken aloud. The institutional coffee tasted different somehow, less bitter, more like the strong brew Harold remembered from late nights in classified facilities, where exhaustion was pushed aside by the urgency of preventing catastrophe. His hands wrapped around the ceramic mug with steadier fingers than had held anything in years. The tremor that had defined his public persona was fading, as muscles remembered how to relax after decades of carrying invisible weight. "I should have looked for you sooner," Halden said quietly, stirring his coffee with the slow deliberation of someone weighing decades of regret. "When the unit disbanded, when the files were sealed, I told myself it was about national security. Truth was, it was easier to let sleeping dogs lie." Harold studied the Admiral's face, noting the lines that hadn't been there 40 years ago, the gray hair that spoke of decades of command decisions. "You had your orders, Admiral. We all did. The machinery of classification doesn't account for individual conscience." The mess hall's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating pools of artificial brightness against the gathering dusk. Through the windows, the evening watch began their rotations, young sailors moving with purpose across tarmac that Harold had walked countless times as a young analyst, when the weight of global stability rested on equations he solved in basement offices, Mallory leaned forward, curiosity overcoming decades of military protocol. His coffee sat untouched as he studied Harold with the intensity of someone trying to understand how history could hide in plain sight. "Mr. Whitmore, what was it like knowing your work saved lives but never being able to talk about it, never getting credit, never even being acknowledged?" Harold turned his ring slowly, the simple gesture now carrying different meaning for everyone who observed it. The silver caught the last sunlight filtering through windows, and for a moment the worn metal seemed to glow with accumulated significance. "Chief, you ever hear a sound that wasn't there? Know something was wrong before anyone else figured it out? Sometimes. Sir, pattern recognition from experience, sixth sense, some call it. That's what we did." Harold's voice carried the weight of memories that had never been shared with anyone outside classified circles. "We listened to the silence between radio transmissions, measured the spaces where enemy submarines should be but weren't, calculated the mathematical probability of peace versus the certainty of war." He paused, taking a slow sip of coffee that seemed to transport him to another time, another place where young men with slide rules and determination stood between civilization and chaos. Every equation we solved meant someone's son came home who might not have otherwise. Every pattern we identified prevented escalations that could have triggered automatic response protocols. Every night I went to sleep knowing that morning might bring nuclear exchange if our mathematics were wrong. Halden nodded slowly, understanding flooding his expression. Operation Nightbridge wasn't just about Soviet submarines. It was about preventing a cascade failure that could have triggered automatic response protocols on both sides. "The Cuban Missile Crisis all over again," Mallory breathed, comprehension dawning. But this time in the Pacific, where response times were measured in minutes instead of hours. Harold reached into his jacket and withdrew the small notebook he'd been carrying all day. Its pages were filled with notations that looked like mathematical poetry. Elegant solutions to impossible problems. Formulas that balanced human survival against geopolitical necessity. "Dmitry Volkov," Harold said, opening to a specific page covered with equations and notations in both English and Cyrillic script. "Soviet naval analyst, just like me. We never met, never spoke, but we played chess through submarine movements for 3 years. I learned to think like him, predict his patterns, understand his logic." He traced a finger across equations that had prevented conflicts the world never knew about, mathematical models that had kept the Cold War cold when it threatened to become incandescently hot. In '79, his patterns changed, became more aggressive, more desperate, submarine deployments that made no tactical sense, positioning that violated everything I'd learned about his strategic thinking. Either he was planning something catastrophic or— Harold paused, a slight smile crossing his weathered features. "Or he was trying to get someone's attention, trying to warn us." Halden's eyes widened with the implications. "You're saying he was feeding you intelligence. A Soviet analyst was deliberately creating patterns you could read." "I'm saying mathematics has no nationality, Admiral, and some people on both sides understood that mutual destruction isn't a strategy, it's a failure of imagination." Harold turned several pages in his notebook, revealing correspondence that had been conducted entirely through mathematical proofs and strategic deployments. Two analysts, separated by ideology and geography, working together to prevent the unthinkable. We corresponded through submarine positioning for 18 months. He'd deploy vessels in configurations that looked threatening, but contained subtle mathematical signatures only I would recognize. I'd respond with fleet adjustments that appeared routine but carried encoded acknowledgments. Together, we developed early warning systems that prevented 3 separate incidents from escalating to nuclear exchange. The 3 men sat in silence, contemplating the implications of what Harold had just revealed. Somewhere in Russia, an elderly man might be sitting alone, carrying his own secrets about prevented catastrophes, wearing his own version of a simple ring that nobody understood. "Where is he now?" Mallory asked quietly. Harold's expression grew distant. "Dmitry died in 1987. Heart attack at his desk, working late as always. I learned about it through intelligence reports 6 months after it happened. Never got to thank him for choosing mathematics over ideology." The weight of that loss hung in the air like incense. Harold closed his notebook slowly, fingers tracing the worn cover that had contained some of the most important equations in human history. "Mr. Whitmore," Halden said finally, his voice carrying the weight of official confession, "there's something I need to tell you about why your records were sealed so deeply, why your very existence was erased from official history." Harold's expression didn't change, but his attention focused with the same intensity Mallory had noticed during the confrontation with Logan. 40 years of wondering were about to find answers. "You saved more than naval operations. You prevented a war, but the methods you used, the mathematical models you developed with Volkov, they were too effective, too accurate. Command realized that if enemies discovered how precisely we could predict their movements, they might develop countermeasures that could leave us blind." Halden leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "So they buried you, buried your methods, your innovations, your very existence. Kept the algorithms but erased the man who created them. Your work was too valuable to risk exposure, and you were too dangerous to acknowledge." Harold absorbed this information without apparent emotion, but his hand moved unconsciously to touch the spot where Halden had pinned the unit insignia hours earlier. "And now the Cold War is over, and the world deserves to know what you accomplished. More importantly, you deserve the recognition that was stolen from you. The algorithms you developed are still in use, still protecting American interests. Your mathematical models form the foundation of current threat assessment protocols." Harold closed his notebook and slipped it back into his jacket. When he looked up, his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there during the morning's humiliation. "Admiral, I spent 40 years wondering if it had all been worth it, wondering if the silence, the isolation, the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared, if any of it mattered." He gestured toward the window, where the last light of sunset painted the base in gold, illuminating young sailors who went about their duties protected by mathematics they would never understand. "Today, for the first time since 1981, I know it was." The three men finished their coffee in comfortable silence, each processing the day's revelations in his own way. Outside, the evening watch began their duties. Protecting a peace they might never know had been preserved by equations written in a basement office 40 years ago. As they prepared to leave, Harold paused at the mess hall entrance, looking back at the simple table where 40 years of secrets had finally found voice. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "some stories are worth the wait." 3 weeks later, the same airfield that had witnessed Harold's humiliation now hosted a different kind of ceremony. Morning sunlight reflected off polished memorial plaques, newly installed along the main walkway that led from the ceremonial hall to the flight line where operational aircraft stood ready for missions that might never come. The highest victory of effective intelligence. Harold Whitmore walked slowly toward the memorial, no longer alone. Chief Mallory accompanied him on the left, Admiral Halden on the right, while a small procession of base personnel followed at respectful distance. The tremor in Harold's hands had lessened significantly over the past weeks, though it would never entirely disappear. Some effects of carrying weight for decades couldn't be completely erased, only distributed among those willing to share the load. The largest memorial plaque bore an inscription that most base personnel would walk past without understanding, but a few would pause to read, "Advanced Operations Squadron 117, 1975-1981. Their service remains classified. Their sacrifice remembered." Below the main text, smaller print listed coordinates that corresponded to prevented conflicts, dates that marked crises averted, and a simple mathematical formula that represented the balance between secrecy and acknowledgement. The ring on Harold's finger caught the light differently now. Still worn, still simple silver, but no longer hidden. The challenge coin in his pocket had been joined by official documentation from the Pentagon, a letter on formal letterhead acknowledging his service and inviting his participation in a classified historical review panel that would spend the next 5 years declassifying Cold War intelligence operations for historical record. Logan Reese stood at attention near the memorial's dedication area. The young SEAL had requested permission to attend, to witness the completion of what he had unknowingly begun with his cruel question about costume jewelry. His career would continue. Halden believed in education over destruction, but his perspective had changed permanently. 3 weeks of mandatory sensitivity training and historical education had taught him that assumptions could be more dangerous than enemy fire. "Mr. Whitmore," Halden said as they reached the memorial. "Would you do the honors?" Harold stepped forward, his movements carrying the measured precision of someone who had finally found his proper place in history. From his pocket, he withdrew not just his challenge coin, but something more significant, the original code key that had enabled his correspondence with Dmitry Volkov, a small piece of metal that had prevented nuclear war through the simple expedient of enabling two enemies to become collaborators. The memorial contained a small ceremonial receptacle built into its base, designed to hold tokens of service that could never be fully explained, but deserved permanent recognition. Harold placed both items inside, his own challenge coin and Dmitry's code key, which Soviet intelligence had delivered through diplomatic channels years after the analyst's death, a gesture of respect that transcended political boundaries. The coins settled with a soft metallic sound that seemed to echo across decades of silence. Finally finding rest and acknowledgement rather than secrecy, the ceremony was brief by necessity, attended by only those with sufficient clearance to understand what was being commemorated. No press, no public recognition. The nature of the service being honored required continued discretion, but representatives from Naval Intelligence, Strategic Command, and the Pentagon's Historical Preservation Office witnessed Harold's moment of vindication. As Harold stepped back from the memorial, Admiral Chen, whom he would meet months later at the Pentagon, handed him a sealed envelope bearing the insignia of the Secretary of the Navy. "Mr. Whitmore," she said with quiet formality, "your country has a request." Harold opened the envelope with steady hands, reading words that invited him to serve again, not in the shadows this time, but as a senior consultant to current intelligence operations, helping modern analysts understand patterns that transcended technological advancement. "Sir," a young voice interrupted the moment. The same petty officer who had approached him weeks earlier now waited with careful respect, holding a tablet displaying mathematical models that descended directly from Harold's original work. "I've been developing applications for your pattern recognition theories. The implications for cyber threat assessment are remarkable." Harold looked at the young officer with interest, seeing in him the same hunger for mathematical elegance that had driven his own career. For the first time in decades, someone was asking about his work not as historical curiosity, but as living, applicable knowledge. "Son," Harold said, and his voice carried the authority that Logan Reese should have recognized months earlier. "Mathematics doesn't retire. Neither do the people who understand how to use it properly." The young officer's face lit up with understanding. "Sir, would you consider mentoring our advanced analytics team? We're working on threat assessment protocols that could benefit from your experience." Harold smiled, feeling decades of isolation finally breaking apart. "I'd be honored." Admiral Halden watched this exchange with satisfaction, understanding that Harold's story wasn't ending with this ceremony. It was beginning a new chapter where experience could be shared rather than buried, where wisdom gained through decades of secrecy could finally serve the next generation. As the official ceremony concluded and small groups formed for informal conversation, Harold found himself surrounded by young officers eager to learn from someone whose mathematical innovations had protected their nation before they were born. Each question, each request for guidance, helped fill the void that 40 years of enforced silence had created. Logan Reese approached hesitantly as the crowd dispersed. His 3 weeks of education had taught him not just about Harold's specific service, but about the broader reality that heroism rarely announced itself with fanfare. "Sir," Logan said quietly, struggling with words that came hard to someone trained in action rather than reflection, "I need to apologize, not just for what I said, but for what I assumed, for thinking that value could be measured by appearance." Harold studied the young SEAL with eyes that had learned to look beyond surface presentations. "Son, you made an error in judgment, but that error led to truth being revealed. Sometimes the worst mistakes create the best opportunities for growth. Sir, is there anything I can do to make amends?" Harold pointed to the memorial where his challenge coin now rested beside Dmitry Volkov's code key. "Remember this moment. Remember that every person you encounter carries invisible history, and when you're in position to make assumptions about someone's worth, choose curiosity over contempt." Logan nodded, understanding that he had been given a gift disguised as discipline, the chance to learn wisdom that might take others decades to acquire. 6 months later, Harold would be invited to brief current naval intelligence personnel on pattern recognition methodologies. His algorithms, updated for modern computational power, would once again serve to keep peace through preparation. Logan would excel in his subsequent assignments, carrying forward the lesson that respect must be earned through giving it first. But today, standing before a memorial that finally acknowledged his existence, Harold Whitmore allowed himself a moment of satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. The ring on his finger no longer carried the weight of secrets. It carried the honor of service remembered and wisdom ready to be shared. Young sailors passed the memorial throughout the day, most unaware of its significance, but a few pausing to read the inscription and wonder about the mathematical formula carved into bronze. Those who asked would learn that some of the most important victories were the wars that never happened, prevented by people whose names would never be known, but whose contributions echoed through decades of preserved peace. The old man, who had been humiliated for wearing costume jewelry, walked away from the ceremony with dignity fully restored, ready to serve again in whatever capacity his experience might benefit the next generation. Behind him, the memorial caught the afternoon light, and the inscription seemed to glow with the quiet pride of service that had waited 40 years to be recognized. The circle was complete, but the story continued, not as history, but as living legacy passed from one generation of guardians to the next, mathematical principles bridging the gap between past sacrifice and future security. Harold Edward Whitmore was finally home,